everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. And my topic for tonight is countering the arrogance of power and the clear likelihood of tyranny coming to the United States. So, I'll get right into it with a couple of articles before I talk about what to do about our present situation. First, I want to go to a piece from Tom Hartman. Appeared in Common Dreams. The caption on this photo is, of course, it's a rear view of Donald Trump. Supporters cheer as Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump arrives to speak during a campaign rally at the historic Greenbrier Farms in Chesapeake, Virginia on July 28, 2024? I don't think so. Must be June 28, 2024. That must be a misprint. Since we got 19 days ago, we have 23 days to go until we get to July 28, 2024. Trump's far-right army is threatening bloodshed. Believe them, says the author, who is Tom Hartman. This was published on July 5th on Common Dreams. It says we must not only resist but prevail. If we do not, it will be nearly impossible to reverse the course that America's right-wing billionaires have set us on. Kevin Roberts, who heads the Heritage Foundation, largely responsible for Project 2025, just implicitly threatened Americans that if we don't allow him and his hard right movement to complete their transformation of America from a democratic republic into an authoritarian state, there will be blood in the streets. Quote, "We're in the process of taking this country back," unquote, he told a TV audience, adding, quote, "The reason that they're apoplectic right now, the reason that so many anchors on MSNBC, for example, are losing their minds daily is because our side is winning. So I come full circle on this response and just want to encourage you with some substance that we are in the process of the second American revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be," unquote. He's not wrong. Okay, America has been, says Tom, he's been changed as a result of a series of corrupt rulings by Republicans. Exclusively, not one of these rulings has been joined by a Democratic appointee, which have changed America's legal and political systems themselves. As Roberts notes, this is really the largest issue we all face, and our mainstream media are totally failing to either recognize or clearly articulate how radically different our country is now, how far the Republicans on the court have dragged us away from both our founders' vision and the norms and standards of a functioning modern democratic republic. First, in a series of decisions, the first written by that notorious corporatist Lewis Powell of, quote, Powell memo, unquote, fame, Republicans on the court have functionally legalized bribery of politicians and judges by both the morbidly rich and massive corporations. It started with Powell's 1978 Bellotti opinion, which opened the door already cracked a bit to the idea that corporations are not only persons, quote unquote, under the Constitution, but more radically are entitled to the human rights the framers wrote into the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. I have to add here that the human rights the framers wrote into the Bill of Rights were certainly intended by them as rights for human individuals, not rights of artificially legal persons. That is quite clear because the founders, the framers, were very much anti-corporation. For them, the typical corporation was the British East India Corporation, and they all hated it. They hated the idea, of corporations. Using that rationale, Powell asserted that corporations, like rich people, from the Buckley decision that preceded Bilotti by 2 years, are entitled to the First Amendment right of free speech. But he took it a radical step further, ruling that because corporations don't have mouths they can use to speak with, their use of money to spend supporting politicians or carpet bombing advertising for a candidate or issue is free speech that can't be tightly regulated. Citizens United, and other all-Republican decision with Clarence Thomas a deciding vote after taking millions in bribes, expanded that doctrine for both corporations and rich people, creating new, quote, dark money systems, new dark money, unquote, systems that wealthy donors and companies can use to hide their involvement in their efforts to get the political, legal, legislative outcomes they seek. Last week, the Republicans on the court took even that a huge step farther, declaring that when companies or wealthy people give money to politicians in exchange for contracts of legislation or other favors, as long as the cash is paid out after the deed is done, it's not a bribe, but a simple gratuity. So in other words, if the corporations say to politicians, if you do this for us, then we will give you X amount of money, then that is not a bribe, but a simple gratuity, quote unquote. So first off, they've overthrown over 240 years of American law and legalized bribery. Last week, they also gutted the ability of federal regulatory agencies to protect average people, voters, employees, and even the environment from corporations that seek to exploit, pollute, or even engage in wage theft. This shifted power across the economic spectrum from a government elected by we the people to the CEOs and boards of directors of some of America's most predatory and poisonous companies. Finally, in the Trump immunity case, the court ruled that presidents are immune from prosecution under criminal law, regardless of the crimes they commit, so long as they assert those crimes are done as part of their official responsibilities. And who decides what's official? The 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court. These actions, corporate personhood, the idea that money is speech, ending the Chevron deference to regulatory agencies, and giving the president life and death powers that historically have only been held by kings, shahs, by mullahs, dictators, and popes, have fundamentally altered the nature, of our nation. I think Tom has left out here the Dobbs decision, which, of course, withdrew the federal right to have an abortion from one of our two genders, specifically women. That has also fundamentally altered the nature of our nation. It's almost impossible to overstate the significance of this or its consequences. We no longer live in America 1.0. This is a new America, one more closely resembling the old Confederacy, where wealthy families and giant companies make the rules, enforce the rules, and punish those who irritate or try to obstruct them. In America 2.0, there is no right to vote. Governors and secretaries can take away your vote without even telling you, although they still must go to court to take away your gun. They can destroy any politician they choose by simply pouring enough cash into the campaign system, including dark, untraceable cash. The president can now go much further than Bush's torturing and imprisoning innocent people in Gitmo without legal process. He can now shoot a person on Fifth Avenue in plain sight of the world, simply call it a necessary part of his job, or impoverish or imprison you and me with the thinnest of legal, official, quote unquote, rationales. America 2.0 is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy, as I wrote about in The Hidden History of American Oligarchy. The South has finally nearly won the Civil War. While it will be months or likely years before all of these new powers the Republicans on the court have given the president, rich people, and corporations begin to dawn on most Americans, they will step by step transform this country into something more closely resembling Hungary or Russia than the democracies of Europe and Southeast Asia. I think that Tom is selling Russia short because I think Russia is moving away from the authoritarian model towards more of a collective leadership regime where many interests and many people have their say. The only remedy at this late stage in this 50-plus year long campaign to remake America is a massive revolt this fall at the ballot box, turning Congress by huge majorities over the Democrats by holding the White House. If we fail at this, while there will be scattered pockets of resistance for years, it'll be nearly impossible to reverse the course that America's right-wing billionaires have set us on. There has never been a more critical time in the history of our nation outside of the last time rich oligarchs tried to overthrow our democracy in the Civil War. Like then, the stakes are nothing less than the survival of a nation of, by, and for we the people. I largely agree with everything that Tom has said here. Most of us are underestimating the changes that the Supreme Court has brought to our country. We are on the verge of tyranny. The infrastructure for tyranny is here. It's been created by the Supreme Court. The latest move to create a president that is nearly immune from the prosecution and is immune for his official acts, for those acts that are core to his constitutional powers, and to those other official acts where he is given a presumption of innocence for what he does, and where his motives for doing these things cannot be brought to a court of law to prove that he was engaged in criminal activity. Forgive me for always saying he here, but so far it's always been a he that we've been talking about when we talk of the president. So I'll come back to this article, a bit later. But now I'm going to move on to our second piece of the night, also from Common Dreams. And this one is called, before we get to what it's called, here's a picture. Former U.S. President Donald Trump shake hands with Supreme Court Justice John Roberts before the State of the Union address in the House chamber on February 4th, 2020 in Washington, D.C. I think the date on this is also mistaken because on February 4th, this is February 4th, 2020. Yes, I was thinking of 2021. The arrogant Supreme Court is now the enemy within, says the headlines. Americans know the Supreme Court's anti-democratic agenda when they see it. We know a judicial power grab. They know a judicial power grab when they see it. They know a king when they see one. Tell me, America, do you like what you see? This is dated today, July 5th, 2024. Former President Richard Nixon used a ridiculous line to rationalize his misconduct. We'll quote, "If the president does it, that means it's not illegal," unquote. On July 1st, 2024, Nixon's outrageous position became the law of the land. But that is only the most recent illustration of how former President Donald Trump's Supreme Court is remaking America. The justices, comprising the court's 6-member conservative supermajority, are foisting their personal vision for the country on citizens who largely disagree with that vision. Trump appointed 3 of them, 3 of the justices, that is. 2 years ago, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization was a harbinger. The court's 6 conservatives overruled the landmark 50-year-old precedent, Roe v. Wade, and obliterated a women's right to abortion, a right that the vast majority of Americans across the political spectrum support. Dobbs was only the beginning. The conservative justice's agenda requires violating the bedrock principle of stare decisis. Justice Elena Kagan explained, quote, "Adherence to precedent is, quote, a foundation stone of the rule of law." Stare decisis promotes, quote, promotes the even-handed, predictable, and consistent development of legal principles, unquote. It enables people to order their lives in reliance on judicial decisions, and it, quote, contributes to the actual and perceived integrity of the judicial process, unquote, by ensuring that those decisions are founded in the law and not in the, quote, personal preferences, unquote, of judges, unquote. Already at a historic low, the court's perceived integrity continues to suffer self-inflicted wounds at the hands of its conservative members. They are imposing their personal preferences on the entire nation. In the waning days of the court's 2023 to 2024 term, some of the most draconian and dangerous emerged from the shadows. The court guts the SEC and imperils other federal agencies. On June 27, 2024, the court's conservative bloc, Justices Samuel Alito, Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, John Roberts, and Clarence Thomas, issued SEC versus Jarchese. The ruling bars the Securities and Exchange Commission from adjudicating civil fraud actions itself before an administrative law judge. Instead, the SEC must now file all such actions in federal court, where a defendant can request a jury trial, thereby crippling the agency's enforcement capabilities. On behalf of the court's three dissenting liberals, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor wrote, quote, Congress has enacted countless new statutes in the past 50 years that have empowered federal agencies to impose civil penalties for statutory violations. Similarly, there are at the very least more than 24 agencies that can impose civil penalties in administrative proceedings. The constitutionality of hundreds of statutes may now be in peril, and dozens of agencies could be stripped of their power to enforce laws enacted by Congress, unquote. Justice Sotomayor added, quote, today's ruling is part of a disconcerting trend. When it comes to the separation of powers, this court tells the American public and its coordinated branches that it knows best. Make no mistake, today's decision is a power grab. Again, today's decision in that quote referred to SEC versus Jarchese. That was the decision. Also on June 27, 2024, in Ohio versus the EPA, 5 of the court's conservatives blocked the Environmental Protection Agency's plan to protect, quote, downwind, unquote, states from the air pollution that, quote, upwind, unquote, states generated. From 1981 to 1983, Justice Gorsuch's mother, Anne, had led the EPA during the Reagan administration. Repeatedly, she clashed with environmentalists and congressional investigators, challenging her management of the agency. In 1983, the White House forced her to resign. In her 1986 memoir, Anne Gorsuch wrote that her rocky tenure and unceremonious departure distressed her son, but Neil, who was 15 years old at the time, quote, you should never have resigned, unquote, he told her, and quote again, You didn't do anything wrong. You only did what the president ordered. Why are you quitting? You raised me not to be a quitter. Why are you a quitter? Unquote. 40 years later, Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion in Ohio versus the EPA. Next section, the court grasps for power, unquote. The following day, on June 28th, the conservative bloc struck again in Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. Who is Raimondo? She is the Biden administration's Secretary of Commerce. First name is Gina Raimondo. Overruling a 40-year-old precedent, Chevron versus National Resources Defense Council. Back in 1984, conservatives had scored a big victory when a unanimous Supreme Court first issued the Chevron ruling. It required that courts defer to administrative agencies that filled in gaps or resolved ambiguities in Congress's regulatory statutes. At the time, business leaders cheered the decision because President Ronald Reagan's EPA under Ann Gorsuch had loosened air pollution emission regulations. To preserve that loosening, the affected businesses wanted courts to respect the EPA's scientific and technical expertise. The court agreed, quote, judges are not experts in the field and are not part of either political branch of the government, unquote. The latter point meant that judges weren't accountable to the electorate, whereas agency administrators served at the pleasure of an elected president. But in the years that followed, businesses chafed at agency regulation. Along with the conservative legal movement, business leaders reversed course and attacked Chevron unsuccessfully until Trump's appointment of Barrett gave the conservatives a supermajority on the Supreme Court. In a dissent, Justice Kagan observed that Chevron, quote, served as a cornerstone of administrative law, allocating responsibility for statutory construction between courts and agencies. It has formed the backdrop against which Congress, courts, and agencies, as well as regulated parties and the public, all have operated for decades. It has been applied in thousands of judicial decisions. It has become part of the warp and woof of modern government, supporting regulatory efforts of all kinds, to name a few, keeping air and water clean, foods and drugs safe, and financial markets honest. Under Chevron, Justice Kagan added, the Supreme Court itself has upheld an agency's reasonable interpretation of a statute at least 70 times. Lower courts have applied the Chevron framework on thousands upon thousands of occasions. Chevron was cited in more than 18,000 federal court decisions, unquote. Quote again, a longstanding precedent at the crux of administrative governance thus falls victim to a bald assertion of judicial authority. Justice Kagan concluded, quote, the majority disdains restraint and grasps for power. The court helps Trump to avoid accountability. The conservative bloc saved its worst for last. The court's July 1, 2024 ruling in Trump versus the United States. If democracy dies in America, Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in the case will have been a key contributor. Quote, we conclude that under our constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of presidential power requires that a former president have some immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts during his tenure in office, unquote. Roberts wrote on the final day of the court's term, quote, at least with respect to the president's exercise of his core constitutional powers, this immunity must be absolute. As for his remaining official actions, he is also entitled to immunity, unquote. Writing for 3 dissenting liberal members, Justice Sotomayor declared, quote, today's decision to grant former presidents criminal immunity reshapes the institution of the presidency. It makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law. Our Constitution does not shield a former president from answering for criminal and treasonous acts, unquote. Trump asserts that if reelected, he'll be, quote, dictator for a day. The Supreme Court ruling makes him comparable to a king, a law unto himself for an entire 4-year term. Quote, I know it when I see it. In discussing a pornography case, Justice Potter Stewart once remarked, quote, I know it when I see it. Well, Americans know the Supreme Court's anti-democratic agenda when they see it. They know a judicial power grab when they see it. They know a king when they see one. And as Americans come to understand, the conservative Supreme Court justices' profoundly negative impact on their daily lives, they won't like what they see. So this article focused mostly on the decisions of the last few days, while Tom Hartman took a broader view, beginning in 1978, okay, in the Bellotti case, and going forward to the Citizens United case in 2010. He failed to mention, of course, the Dobbs case of 2022, though that was mentioned at least, okay, in the article by that at least was mentioned in the article by Stephen Harper. Between the two articles, we have a whole list of cases where the court's opinions have to be overturned. Let us know the cases. Okay, the first is the Bellotti decision, which opened the door to the idea that corporations are not only persons under the Constitution, but are entitled to the rights in the Bill of Rights. Then there was the Citizens United decision of 2010, which has opened up our politics to dark money and to huge amounts, of money, of independent, expenditures. Filtering the money of rich people through groups that are supposed to have no coordination with campaigns, but that honor that rule, in the breach. Then of course, the Republicans on the court legalized what they call gratuities. So that case has to be reversed, as well. Then, of course, there was the Chevron deference case, where the whole basis of the administrative state was undermined by the Supreme Court. Then also there was the SEC versus Jarchese case, where the SEC can no longer adjudicate civil fraud actions. That one certainly has to be reversed. Then in Ohio versus EPA, we have, an undermining of the EPA, undermining of the EPA by a vengeful son whose mother was forced out of the EPA through criticism. Then, in the Loper case, the Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo case, Chevron deference, it was overturned. And the basis of the administrative state, which was the Chevron decision, was destroyed. And then the worst case of all, which is the declaration that the president has very widespread degree, of immunity from criminal prosecution while he's in the presidency and after he leaves office. This relates to such things as the pardoning power, which is considered to be core to the presidency, but also it has to do with foreign affairs, where the president's role is considered to be core to his presidency. Now, there is a clause in the Constitution, it's the Emoluments Clause, which prohibits the president from accepting any emoluments, financial rewards, or other rewards from foreigners or foreign governments. And that, of course, was violated by Donald Trump from day one. But according to this particular decision, since that involved foreign policy, foreign affairs, interactions with the foreign government, the president now is said to have absolute immunity against prosecution for his foreign policy acts. Of course, the commander-in-chief function is also part of the core powers, of the presidency. And if the president commits, illegal acts as the commander-in-chief, such as ordering the military to do illegal things in the United States, then the president is supposed to have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. So obviously, Trump versus the United States has to be overturned too, because it has been a key principle of our society and of the Constitution that no man is above the law, including and especially the President of the United States. Trump versus the United States directly contradicts that. It directly contradicts that. And it does this, in the name of the Constitution. But we can see that it's the court interpreting the Constitution, inventing out of whole cloth a need for the president to be protected from lawfare. Nowhere in the Constitution is such a need addressed or postulated. And on the basis of such a need, this group of Supreme Court justices has legislated new constitutional powers for the president as if they were part of the Constitution, as if that immunity was part of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has imported it into the Constitution. It has legislated it into the Constitution. It has violated separation of powers to put it into the Constitution. It has violated the need for amendment procedures to put new things into the Constitution. It has done all that in that case. So, These decisions and Shelby County versus Holder, which undermined the Civil Rights Act of 1965, all of these decisions of the Supreme Court, taken together with some other decisions dealing with essentially allowing voter suppression, and gerrymandering, all those cases need to be reversed if we are to get our political system back. So the question is, how do we reverse all of these decisions and all of the damage that has been done by these Republican Supreme Courts? So let us now address that question. There is a clause in the Constitution, which is often written about by Tom Hartman, though he did not write about that clause in this particular article. But it represents a means of change, because it says that through legislation, which includes within it the exceptions clause of Article 3, Section 2, the cases that the appellate courts, including the Supreme Court, can take up can be regulated by Congress. Not simply regulated, the Congress can prohibit the Supreme Court from taking up certain issues and certain legislation that the Congress has passed. In other words, Congress can cut the Supreme Court out of the action. It can do so with respect to laws passed that repeal the decisions made in the court cases that we've been talking about for most of this hour, including the very last obnoxious decision of the Supreme Court, making the president above the law. So there's a technical way through to get rid of all these very damaging decisions and restore our democracy. But how do we do it from a practical political standpoint, from a practical political point of view? Well, I know there's not much time left in the 2024 campaign. But the first step, in an action to heal the damage caused by the Supreme Court, and also to make Project 2025, to make it impossible to implement it, and to also make it impossible for Trump to be a dictator if he wins, there is a way to do that. And the way begins by people in the next election campaign the way begins by having by voters determining that they will not vote for any Republicans for Congress in 2024. Not for the House of Representatives and not for the Senate. And of course, not for the presidency. This is completely apart from who the Democrats choose to run, nor am I advocating for support of the Democratic candidate. I leave it up to people to decide who they want to support, as long as people are non-Republicans. Why non-Republicans? Because every Republican in Congress, with the possible exception of Thomas Massie, supports what the current Supreme Court has done and supports the various decisions that have been taken by the Supreme Court since 1978 that have taken away our democracy. That is why we have to vote for non-Republicans and against all Republican candidates, and why we must do that systematically and uniformly. We must develop a movement, to do that, because all kinds of damage can be healed if we have a president, in the White House who is not in support of the changes made by the Supreme Court and who is willing to help the Congress to legislate to overturn all of these decisions by the Supreme Court. So we have to elect that kind of candidate. And one requirement, of course, is that that person can't be a Republican, because all the Republicans, except for Thomas Massie, support what has been done, have enabled what has been done all through the years. They have been, the enablers of setting up this tyranny of the judiciary that we currently live with, that is about to be expanded, if we let it, to a tyranny of the chief executive, to a tyranny of the presidency. So the first step is to get all of the Republicans out of office, if we can possibly do that. And if we can't possibly do that, to get as many of them out of the House and out of the Senate as we possibly can. So there are large non-Republican majorities. I don't care if Green Party candidates are elected. I don't really care what the parties or the people are, who are elected, as long as they're willing to undo all of the damage that has been introduced by the Supreme Court. That's the movement we need. That's the campaign, that we need. Once we get that done, we will have a new Congress on January 3rd. At that point, we have to have the new Congress write laws repealing all the decisions of the Supreme Court, okay, that I mentioned here. Not one should survive. All of the laws undoing what's been done by the Supreme Court need to have the exceptions clause in them so the Supreme Court can do nothing about them. Now, most probably President Biden will still be president between January 3rd and January 20th. So he will still be in place to sign these laws. I think that what he should probably do, because he obviously is no longer competent to be the President of the United States, I think what he should obviously do is to declare that he will not be running for re-election. I think he should do that in the next a few days, or certainly few weeks. That makes him something of a neutral party. I think this campaign should be led by the candidates of the non-Republican parties, by Jill Stein, by Cornel West, by the Cornel West party, okay, by the party, I guess it's called the We the People Party, okay, that Bobby Kennedy has started. I think the Democrats and also the third-party candidates should all come together to lead the anti-Republican campaign, to insist that the Republicans must be defeated because they have undermined the foundations of the Republic, and that to fix the undermining, which is this series of Supreme Court cases, there must be heavy majorities of non-Republicans in both houses of Congress and a non-Republican, okay, in the presidency. Now, I'm prepared to say more, but I won't be talking about that tonight. I'll be postponing that until tomorrow night when I will be back for a Saturday show. But for now, I'm going to leave you with this, and I will take your comments, which ought to take a few minutes. So Dolores says hello and sharing. Thank you, Dolores. April says, hiya, Joe. Kids are at the pool listening and folding clothes. Press like and share, beautiful people. Thank you, April. Is that threat by the 2025 project, right-wing fascist free speech? Project 2025 will morph into a threat to free speech. Certainly. April says, I really try not to support corporations and industries. They have too much power. Everybody agrees that's true. April says, Joe, they aren't just, decisions. They are, an agenda. I agree. They weren't decisions that were disconnected. They were an agenda. And the agenda started with Lewis Powell's memo, which was written in 1972 and 1973. The agenda was crafted over the years. And now Project 2025 embodies the agenda. The Supreme Court has been working for that agenda. Catherine Lewandowski says, "Hey, Joe, such great news about the elections in the UK." I don't think it's such great news, Catherine. I think the Labour Party is now a neoliberal party. Keir Starmer is a neoliberal. It'll be a miracle if he does anything that really helps people, inside of the UK. The most likely thing that's going to happen in the UK is that he will miserably fail. Then people will be looking for alternatives who promise them various things. And then we'll be looking at Nigel Farage as a premier of the future. We'll be looking at the rise of a fascist movement, in the UK. It's good news, that Labour won, of course, because the Tories were thoroughly bankrupt. But we cannot expect for Labour to do anything consequential, in the UK. We have to be really skeptical about that. April says, "Do you think Obama is giving Biden any advice about how to neutralize the corrupt SCOTUses? Isn't he a constitutional attorney?" He used to teach constitutional law, but I think it's been years since he's done anything in that situation. Of course, he knows a lot more constitutional law than Joe Biden does. He hasn't used his knowledge of constitutional law for the benefit of the people. Why should he start to do that now? Even Selena says, "Wouldn't that be voting for the U.S. equivalent, i.e. the Dems?" Not necessarily. That's why I've emphasized you want to have non-Republicans in there. And I leave it up to the people as to what kind of non-Republicans they want in there. And I put the following to you. However horrible the Democrats have been, they have not been for any part of the agenda that the Supreme Court has passed over all of these years. If Democrats, are elected, and it's understood that the overwhelming election of non-Republicans, including, a lot of Democrats, happened because of the enablement by the Republicans of this horrible Supreme Court agenda, then I think it's very likely that this new Congress will move to get rid of everything the Supreme Court, has done. So I'm not advocating for re-election of the Democrats. I'm advocating for people viewing this as a contest between the Democrats, the Greens, the We the People Party, and whatever Cornel West is calling his particular party. I want people to view them as their range, of choices. If out of this range of choices they choose to turn to the Democrats, that's their choice. But for healing the immediate damage, which has been done by the Supreme Court, I think the requirement has to be that we get all the Republicans out of there and we put in a whole set of non-Republicans in Congress. Catherine says, yes, taking the Republicans out of the majority. Catherine says they need to be impeached. The Supreme Court members need to be impeached also, but the problem with impeachment is that it's too slow. It's simply too slow. What we need initially to do to the Supreme Court before we attempt impeachment is to pass a law which the Supreme Court would not be able to review because it has the exceptions clause that expands the Supreme Court by 6 members. That would have to be done very, very quickly, unless, of course, a Democrat, or a third party candidate was elected as president of the United States. And we could take a lot more time in adding the 6 members to the Supreme Court. But with one law, we'd be able to disempower this conservative Supreme Court. They would no longer have a majority. And of course, it would be the legislature that undid the damage that they had done, over a period of years. But to prevent them from now doing further damage, we also passed a law between January 3rd and January 20th, which expands the Supreme Court by 6 members. Why by 6 members rather than 4? Because we allow for errors in the appointment of new Supreme Court justices. We don't want people appointed who would make common cause with the present 6. But if the president should make a mistake in appointing someone who would make common cause with them, we need to have some leeway for error. That's why we need to specify 6 more justices for the Supreme Court and not just 4. Catherine says ours are not, in the majority. I'm not sure what you mean by that. They are in the majority in the House right now. April says, any good news about replacing Biden? Well, supposedly Biden is thinking of stepping down still. There are conflicting reports. He's also in a fighting mood. But I think he's clearly considering stepping down. He's going to be fighting probably over the next week or 2 in various ways to see if the polls are affected. I believe that after 2 weeks, if the polls still look as bad for him as they look now, he may well decide that he wants to withdraw. Can we tell them that the Supreme Court decision can affect them too if the president is a Dem? Yes, we can tell them that. And of course, but still, most of the decisions favor their side anyway. And so they will have an incentive to try to save the decisions. And their donors will want them to save the decisions. Catherine says, late? Great. I thought the conservatives were the problem. Yes, they are. Catherine says, well, it needs to happen. I believe that we should expand it to a total of 12. No, that is too few. If we expand to a total of 12, there are 3 more added. So the best we could expect for is a tie of 6-6. We don't want a tie, of 6-6. If we expand it by 6, then we have a total in the Supreme Court of 15 justices, and we should have a majority of 9-6 in that case. If you're saying, that you should believe it, we should expand by 12 new justices, well, I don't really have any objection to that. That would give us a total of 21 justices. A majority, to have a majority then, we could have a majority of 11-10 then, in certain instances, but we would start off, okay, with the majority of, let's see, 12, of 15 to 6, of course. Catherine says that makes it a majority, that there is a supermajority to overturn a decision by a lower court. Evelyn says, so it's posing my questions to Catherine. I understood what you said. Oh, sorry, Evelina. Catherine says Republican voters are not in the majority. No, they're not in the majority. If we're looking at the voters, it looks like the independents are in the majority right now, according to what Bobby Kennedy recently said. I don't know if he's right. I haven't been following the polls as closely as that. But he has claimed that now 52%, okay, of independents, there are 52% of independents, 25% of Republicans, and 23%, okay, of Democrats. That's what he's claiming. I don't know if he's right. Lana says the convention is August 19 to 22, so they better get their ducks in a row if they're going to pick someone else. Yes, unless they want to have an open convention. Catherine says if it's tied, they can't change a decision of a lower court. Yes, that's true. But we don't know how a lower court would decide, okay, the question. It's better to have the legislation protected from all of the appellate courts, so there's no judicial review. So that Congress passes these laws, and they are the law of the land without judicial interference. So I'll discuss this further tomorrow night and say some more things about some other things that can be done. But for now, I'm going to say goodnight, and I'm going to go over to help Dee with her show, okay, which is Around the World with Dee and Friends. And hopefully you'll all follow me over there, where we'll be talking most probably about international relations issues. Most probably the show will be on the Middle East, because that's what it's usually about. Joe, do you think SCOTUS term limits are needed? I think term limits are a good idea also. And of course, if we had a non-Republican majority in, we could probably legislate some term limits for the Supreme Court, okay, as well. So good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. Attendance was good again tonight. I very much appreciate that. Well, please do remember I have a patreon.com account and a buymeacoffee.com/Joe.Firestone. Patreon account is patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. So they're very similar. And I'd appreciate any financial support that you could give. So once again, thank you for coming. And hopefully I'll see you over at Dee's.